All right, so we're going to get started this afternoon, and this is a session on really talking about trauma and the alignment of how we can really think about the classroom practices and Tier 1 support, and the classroom practices we use at Tier 1, and keeping that trauma-informed lens. Kind of looking at what we already do with that trauma-informed lens. And it's this, you know, this afternoon, Patty, going to be talking about alignment, essentially, how this all works together. And a lot of what I'm going to be talking about today is also under that umbrella of alignment, and how, you know, we're learning a lot about trauma. We're learning about the impacts of trauma. We are being informed in schools more and more about the impact of trauma on kids' lives and the impact that has. All right. So today, what I want to be able to do is review those concepts related to trauma, knowing that you all have likely already received some professional development, engaged in maybe some detailed reading, et cetera, around trauma, and have. So this isn't a kind of a detailed presentation on trauma, but it's in, you know, anchors around some of those critical elements of trauma and trauma-informed practices, and talk about how, at the classroom level, we can think about the practices that we engage in, the activities that teachers engage in with students, and how those are trauma-informed, or how we might enhance our trauma-informed lens in that setting. All right. So I'm going to illustrate those strategies and then also provide those specific examples. I want to give some examples here. I'm sorry, some acknowledgments here. So we have SAMHSA, and you know, again, wonderful documentation around what we know about trauma, prevalence of trauma, impact of trauma, and we'll talk about some other critical elements that SAMHSA has outlined as far as the effects of trauma, and how we can think about our days with that trauma-informed lens. I'm going to pass around some handouts here, some note takers that will help guide the dialogue this afternoon. All right. I'm going to pass one over. I'll get that. Yeah, I have another handout coming too. So. So while I'm handing this out, the other folks that I want to thank are my partners at the Midwest PBIS Network. Is this who've really done a lot of work, especially around the alignment of trauma-informed practices and classroom strategies. We've worked with them very closely around classroom management procedures. There you go. I'm sorry to sneak up on you. I'd say they were generous enough when I asked if I could borrow some of their content. They said, sure thing, why not? And so you'll see some of the examples that they have in here that are included in here come from that Midwest group. Jerry, if you don't have enough, I have more. All right, perfect. All right, and then the Center for Social Behavior Support, which is really a combination of our Mid-Atlantic folks and our Midwest folks. So just some acknowledgments, knowing that a lot of this content is borrowed from others, and I'll be acknowledging Bloomsburg University in a few minutes as well. So before we get into this, I just want to play about a minute or two of the video.
In the mid-90s, the CDC and Kaiser Permanente discovered an exposure that dramatically increased the risk for 7 out of 10 of the leading causes of death.
We're going to just listen to it.
In high doses, It affects brain development, the immune system, hormonal systems, and even the way our DNA is read and transcribed. Folks who are exposed in very high doses have triple the lifetime risk of heart disease and lung cancer, and a 20-year difference in life expectancy. And yet doctors today are not trained in routine screening or treatment. Now, the exposure I'm talking about is not a pesticide or packaging chemical. It's childhood trauma.
All right, so I played about 37.5 seconds of a 15-minute TED Talk. And that's by Dr. Burke Harris. You might have heard of her before. She speaks a lot. She's a pediatrician in California who speaks a lot on the impacts of trauma on childhood. And as she mentioned, throughout the life course. And I think we all in this room know, now know, that the events and those incidents that can occur in a child's life can have a significant long-term impact on their physiological well-being, not just how they interact in a classroom in the immediate, but in the future, those long-term impacts. And so what we'll do is have that link available to you in the slides that will be posted on the PBIS Maryland website. So you can find that TED Talk. She goes into a lot more information. And I really like how she also talks about this through that public health lens, and instead of trying to just treat every individual problem, kind of getting to the root cause and make more trauma-informed and supportive environments. And that's really why we're here today, to talk about that. All right, resume slideshow. You are already resumed in your slideshow, are you not? I am not. Thank you for bearing with me as I fumble through this. I'm going to stop it and start it again. Pardon me for the technical difficulties. All right. And then for the audio, that was the only audio I had coming through the computer, so I don't know if that can be disconnected or not. Thanks. All right, so with your handout that I gave you, kind of the guided notes handout, there are some sections to put some of this content in here. I have a trauma bucket, classroom practices bucket, and then we'll talk about alignment and other considerations. And so, as a refresher for folks, this is pulling from the SAMHSA information about the 3 E's of trauma, recognizing that there are events in individuals' lives that could be considered traumatic events, right? And it's an actual event or a very high likelihood of a very significant event occurring that could be these events in an individual's life. And then we also know that the experience is there too. So it's really how that individual goes through that experience that gives an indication as to what the impact of that traumatic event is going to have on them, all right? So just because a student may have family that goes through divorce, and that's considered an ACE or an adverse childhood event, doesn't necessarily mean that that is going to impact them the same way as it might impact another student, right? And so counselors in this room who might run groups, like a banana split group or whatever you want to call it, it's not necessarily the event that would indicate that a student needs the support. It's how they experience that event and the impact on them. All right, and that gets into the effect kind of consideration. And thinking about the event and to include really how this is going to be impacting them on a long-term basis, right? How many folks have heard the bear in the woods analogy when talking about trauma? All right. Got about not many folks, so that's good. I'm not going to go into all the technical components of this analogy. Some folks, we can get into it even in more detail. But say you're going through the woods and you see a bear. What does your body do? What's going on with you? And what's your reaction? You see this. But yeah, get down below those terms. What's going on? What do you feel? You feel sweat. You feel scared, right? Other reactions? Heart's racing. All right. Yeah, and I just was watching. I watch a Netflix show called Working Moms, and one of the scenes is a working mom taking her child through the park, and there's a bear, and the bear's right there. And, so in a second she freezes, and then she thinks, and then she stands in front of the stroller and just screams at this bear, right? And so you can see all that physiological reaction going within her. And so your brain is acting in a different way, right? Your brain is giving signals that you have to get into flight, fight, or freeze. And so that's how you're going to interact when you see something like this in the woods, right? All right. To a youth who has experienced trauma, anything can look like a bear, though, right? And it's that physiological reaction that occurs. The same thing as if you or I went into the woods and experienced a bear. The same thing is happening to kids that experience traumatic events. And so what might look like a bear to a student is a touch on the shoulder, all right? Or a raised voice, or a last minute change in routine, or a noise, right? That's their bear, all right? And so we may not know what their bear is, right? It might not know what it looks like or when they saw this bear, but we do know that they have seen a bear before. And we just need to make sure that we understand that they're now wired to see a bear anywhere. All right? And so that gets, before we started here, I was having a conversation about, a sidebar conversation, and that gets to the why. Understanding, why do our kids sometimes react this way? And it could be because there's a bear in their past, or there's currently a bear in their environment, right? And we just need to figure out what that is, so that we don't continue to add trauma to that. And so that gets us to that flight, fight, or freeze response. And this is what that looks like in the classroom. And that was your first reaction, right? When I said, when you see a bear in the woods, you guys are throwing these terms up automatically, right? And so this is what it looks like in the classroom when students are engaged in that. And so take a look at that and just pair and share real quick in a minute. Talk to a neighbor and reflect on these behaviors and what you've heard from teachers or what you see in your own classroom and how this aligns. Right? Just 1 minute talk, pair and share to your neighbor. Reactions. What are you guys talking about? What are you all talking about? What you've been seeing, the withdrawal, the numbness, yeah. You like that crosswalk there, right? And this comes from a reference here, Strategies for Creating a Trauma-Sensitive Classroom by Sowers and Hall, all right? And they did a crosswalk. They mapped out what the flight, fight, or freeze. I'm trying to merge freeze and fight at the same time, so I apologize. So what they are doing here is is doing that crosswalk on what this looks like in the classroom, right? Because a lot of times, what do some of these behaviors look like in the classroom to us? sometimes. Take our trauma-informed hat off for a second. Acting out, defiance, right? All right? So it's getting us as adults to rethink the why. Why might some of these behaviors occur? I'm not saying that every time a student is being hyperactive or refusing to do their work or something like that, that it's trauma-based. But we need to think that first versus just pure defiance, right? Because we're going to approach things in a much different way. And so we need to be thinking with this lens first for every student, because we don't know. We don't know if they have a bear in their past. And it might have been a big grizzly bear or it might have been a small bear. But go back to those 3 E's, it depends on their experience with that bear, right? And so we can't make assumptions about experiences that we know students have had and what kind of impact that's going to have on their interactions. It's unique for every individual kid. All right? And so again, thinking about those bears and what those bears are and what they might be eliciting. These behaviors might be elicited through those. All right? The other concept around trauma that is important to remember, and again, this is all kind of thinking about the context of trauma and understanding what we know about best practices and trauma-informed approaches, is knowing those critical elements, and then how can we apply those critical elements and that understanding in how we interact with kids on a daily basis, hourly basis, minute-to-minute basis in our classrooms. And so what we do know is that a trauma-informed system in schools realizes the impact of trauma, and that this is far more widespread than we knew a few years ago, right? We've really grown to know a lot. And so we need to understand that there are also paths to recovery, that we have the ability to create an environment that is more restorative for these students, and an environment that is more supportive and is not going to re-traumatize the student unintentionally, right? And so what we need to do is we realize the widespread impact of trauma. We recognize what those signs and symptoms are of trauma, just like that crosswalk before, all right? On the fight, flight, or freeze. Mapping those symptoms out, those behaviors out differently than we have in the past. We also know that we need to set up systems that respond by really integrating the knowledge that we have about trauma and infusing what we know about trauma into our policies and practices. And the good thing is I think we're there, right? I see some heads nodding. Yeah. How many folks have gone through how many folks have their district has provided some kind of training around trauma-informed practices? Yeah. Yep. So we're doing that, and and we're at the point where we're acknowledging that. We're at the point where we're seeing more of this written into policy. And now I think what we need to be thinking about is how can we intentionally look at our practices and interact and modify and set up our environments in an intentional way that we're approaching things through a trauma-informed lens. Because I'll give you a little heads up. There's probably not much in this today that is like brand spanking new, where you're going to walk out and go, oh my gosh, you have just taught me 1,000 new things I had never heard of before. No, because we're doing this stuff, and that's the good thing, is that this isn't going to be a heavy lift for staff. It's improving your intentionality with the things that you're already doing, all right? I think one of the ways that we can definitely improve our intentionality more is resisting the re-traumatization of students. And we do this unintentionally, right? Because we're not thinking about those bears. We're thinking about that behavior, not thinking about that full context all the time. And so our responses might unintentionally re-traumatize that student. And we're getting better at that again, but it's down to the intentionality of how we use those practices, those best practices, in a way that are supportive and not re-traumatizing. So go back to like your PBIS Tier 1 training, day 1, hour, 1 and 12 minutes in, right? And we talk about the core elements of PBIS as a framework, data-driven framework that helps us organize our evidence-based practices along a continuum of support, right? It's team-based. We talk about creating that language, common vision, common practices. Those are those elements of effective organization. And the big thing here, the reason we do that, the reason we create that matrix, the reason we create lesson plans so that we're all teaching the same way, the reason that we create procedures around recognition so we're all doing things kind of the same way. I'm saying go back 20 years. Go back to the first day that the PBIS Tier 1 training came out. This language was in there. We're doing that so that we can make environments predictable, positive, safe, and consistent. And all of those things are trauma-informed. That's what we want to do in a trauma-informed system. We're creating predictability. We're creating a more positive environment, a consistent environment. Those are all preventative, proactive ways to engage in a trauma-informed practice within your system. So you should high-five yourself right now because you already are approaching things. Jerry's high-fiving. Thank you. Because we're already doing things in our system that are trauma-informed. And what I'd like you to do as coaches and the experts of PBIS in your system is think about this. When you hear things coming in from your district and from other organizations, think to yourself, you know what, let's map this on what we're already doing because this aligns with the core of what we're doing here, right? Not an add-on. So let's think about this concept of working smarter, not harder, right? Not an add-on, aligning with what you already do. And we're going to take it down to classroom practices, right? So, because that's where we interact with kids the most. The teachers in the building are the folks who interact with the kids most of the time. And so we can align what we're talking about here to evidence-based classroom practices, right? And we have 8 classroom practices here. I believe soon to be 6, but 8 right now. These come from a lot of research conducted by Brandy Simonson and other colleagues. And if you've ever accessed that U.S. Department of Ed OSEP document on responding to classroom behaviors, all of these practices are listed in there. And so these are the things when we go to Tier 1 trainings and we talk about that item 1.8 on your TFI, again, aligning it back to Tier 1, that these are the practices that we want to see in place in classrooms. And chances are, as a coach or a team lead or a district coordinator, you have thought about how are we going to train staff and support staff on these practices, right? Going back to those outcome systems data practices, how do we train and support staff on these evidence-based strategies? And you likely have, and you likely monitored the impact of these, or how folks are implementing these strategies. And the next thing that you want to do then, I want you to think about is how can we use what we're already doing and build upon that? And how can we really paint the picture of alignment for our staff? So again, we're not doing something new. We might modify what we're doing, but this isn't new. So we're going to go through a few of these strategies in more detail. But first, what I'd like you to do is I'm going to hand out this other document. All right. And I'm going to have you work in small groups. And this is a document from the McDowell Institute. Jerry, I'm going to ask for your help again if you can. This is a document from the McDowell Institute at Bloomsburg University. And they're doing some great work on, they do some great work on classroom management. They do a lot of work on suicide prevention. And they've been focusing a lot on trauma-informed practices recently. And so what I'd like you to do is when you get the handout, work in small groups. And on the back, you're going to see, oops, pardon me. Yeah. You're going to see another component from SAMHSA here, and that's the core principles of a trauma-informed approach. And what I would like you to do is with a partner, look at the back of this handout on the core principles of the trauma-informed approach, And look at the list up there. And I want you to circle, you might need reading glasses. I do. Yeah, you sure can. What I'd like you to do is look through the right-hand, so on the left-hand side of the table, you have a column of those core principles and trauma-informed practices or approaches. And then what I'd like you to do as a group is look at the description on the right-hand side and look at that list up there. Circle the practices that align with those 8 classroom practices, right? Does that make sense? Thumbs up if it makes sense, thumbs down if it doesn't. No thumbs, I'm not sure, I got a few thumbs. All right, good, perfect. All right, so let's, I'm gonna have you work on that. I'm gonna start with 7 minutes on the clock for that, and I'll check in to see if you need more time, all right? Feel free to talk, walk around, get loud. Not party.
Overlaps with it. Anything has to do with providing good as well.
All right, I'm going to do If you need more time, just give me a thumbs up or a hands up. If you're good, we can, all right, we need a few more minutes. I'll put 2 more minutes. We have some index cards coming through there for some activities after this.
And the acknowledged students and encourage all students to review and mistakes for prompting accepted. And empowerment, voice, and choice. The second one says provide sufficient opportunities to respond. Alternatives to timeout procedures in response to misbehavior. They continue on those comments. There's cooperation and response. And that has to do with interactions between students. It depends on what the teachers say.
All right, so let's come together as a large group. Has anyone seen this McDowell report before? It's pretty good, isn't it? Yeah. Big group of people up there. A lot of good work. Tim Noster heads that up, and he's been the head of the Association of Positive Behavioral Supports for years. We're involved heavily with that organization. What were some things that stood out to you when you looked at this list of evidence-based practices that we've talked about in PBIS or in MTSS, whatever that multi-tiered language you want to talk about is? What were some of the things that you noticed? Or things that you know that you're already doing? Yes?
Direct instruction was repeated.
Mm-hmm. Direct instruction, yep. And direct instruction of what? Everything.
Positive behaviors.
Yeah.
We're
Yeah.
supposed to be doing in every area.
Yeah, exactly. So a lot of what you're already doing when you're thinking about your matrix and your teaching procedures and being very explicit in that. And I think if we think about the terms explicit, direct, and intentional, because you're going to look through this and you're going to think, we're doing a lot of this already. But the question is, what is the intentionality? How planned are you in how you're doing this so that you are actually engaging in that social emotional instruction in a very intentional way that's trauma informed? All right? Other things that showed up. Yes?
Modeling the prosocial behavior and response to behavior in your class and with kids, and just show them, hey, look, you can't ruffle me. This is how you can respond.
Yes. Yeah, so, right. Modeling that calm, self-regulated behavior, right? Exactly. All right. Anything else that showed up? What else did you notice in here? Proactive, right? Definitely proactive. Thanks. All right. All right, so we're going to go through a few of these strategies explicitly. All right? And we're gonna use those index cards a little bit later in some of the activities, so if you didn't get one, don't worry about it. My helpers can be done helping for now, thank you. All right, so we're going to talk about specifically what you mentioned, that direct instruction, that instructionality of teaching expectations and classroom routines and procedures. So I want to see a show of hands too. We've been working with that teaching matrix, right? Your school-wide matrix for years. And we've started really putting a lot more emphasis on the classroom matrix, where you list out your routines and procedures and develop a classroom matrix. How many folks have in their buildings teachers or grade groups or subject area groups that have really developed out that classroom matrix? Where you'd have things like when you come in, the morning routine, in small group instruction. I'll give you some examples. I see some hands, all right? And I've seen some examples. I was gonna say, I think your hand.
We pushed it a few after our work last year.
Yep. And so, so the good thing is that some of this will be new and think, oh yeah, you know what, that's an expansion. That's something that we can add on to our tier 1 system, all right? So thinking about this, when you think about, all right, talking to your staff, talking to administrators, talking to district people, how is the work that we're doing trauma-informed? When you think about the defining and teaching expectations, this really is a trauma-informed process. You're creating that predictability of adult behaviors, right? Because that matrix is really for us to identify what is it that we collectively expect from our kids, so that there's consistency across classrooms. And that came up a little bit this morning during the panel session. Some of the challenges we have with check-in, check-out is that there's some inconsistency when kids change rooms and how they're rated based on the different perception of teacher as far as the expectations. So the more we can firm that up, the better. We can really have those expected definitions. We can differentiate purposeful rules from unpredictable rules, so we can build in that consistency for students and give them that sense of security. So this is an example of a classroom matrix, all right? This is what I'm talking about. So usually in a school-wide matrix, you have classroom, right? Where you have all areas, you have classroom, you'll have hallway, you'll have cafeteria, you might have parking lot, might have playground, depending on your grade levels and the setup of your building. And so what we've been doing recently is saying, you know what, that's awesome, keep that matrix, but let's now kind of take that classroom column and pull it out and make it its own matrix. So now what we're seeing is we're asking systems and schools to develop a classroom matrix, so that now we're defining out what does it look like to be safe, respectful, and responsible during our morning routine when we come into the classroom. If you finish early, what are some things that you can do? How to do a lineup or a transition. And then also, we're doing a lot now with when you feel upset. And so some systems are really pulling that in either to their school-wide matrix or their classroom matrix to build in that social emotional learning component. And that's a great way to put in place strategies that are necessary for kids who have experienced trauma and have a negative impact from that, all right? This is where you can teach those self-awareness strategies, those regulation strategies, and we'll get to a few of those in a few minutes, all right? So if you haven't moved into the classroom matrix arena with your teams yet and your staff, I would consider that as probably a really good action item for next year, as something to work towards. There's more information on the PBIS Maryland website around the classroom matrix, around classroom systems, and some additional resources, but definitely an area to consider building out, because you can expand on this when you're thinking about how to infuse that trauma-informed lens within the classroom. The other thing to think about here, and this is kind of what I was just talking about, but and I mentioned this morning, are we have the compliance behaviors in our matrix, but we also need to make sure that we have the pro-social skills in there, all right? So it's kind of moving beyond just compliance to getting into the heart of what we really need to be teaching for our kids. This is the intentionality, all right? This is how we become intentional in what we do. And it's making sure that we're mapping things out, making sure that we know what behaviors we're asking of our kids, and we're explicitly teaching them. All right? Again, explicitly teach them, develop lesson plans, connect your social emotional curriculum in here. You were talking about zones of regulation with check in, check out. And again, so thinking about how can we get some of that language is zones of regulations even into our classroom matrices. I think, did you mention the calming corners, or was that? Yeah, well, yeah, I said if you had not, where you have the calming corners too. And you'll see that in a second. But think, how does this all work together? This is what I'm saying to you. I'm not saying that there isn't anything to learn from this, because there's a lot to learn from this session, but nothing that I'm telling you right now is relatively new, right? It's just how do you use what you already have in a very aligned and meaningful way and know that if I do it this way, I'm creating a more trauma-informed environment for our kids, right? It goes back to intentionality. So thinking about this too, thinking about defining your classroom routines, considering self-awareness and regulation and relationship development. I'll give you a few examples of that in a few minutes, all right? So establishing a schedule. So I want you to think about this. This school has mapped out a routine, a schedule, and intentionally put in here what they're hitting here. They're hitting relationships here by greeting students at the door, right? And how many videos have popped up in the last 6 to 9 months on door greeting, right? Different creative ways that teachers greet kids at the door, whether they all have their own signal or there's something posted on the door and you get to pick what greeting you get for that day. Smallest amount of change that can make a big impact. That's what we're going for here, all right? And they know that if I do that, we're working on relationships. Morning mindfulness is around regulation strategies. Even within ELA, writing STEM, talking about incorporating some self-awareness strategies in there. And after lunch break for regulation, before math brain break, regulation and priming the brain, and then a daily gratitude and agenda for self-awareness. All right. And then also thinking about some other times when we think about SEL lessons in circles, talking about relationships and self-awareness. All right. Again, it comes down to establishing that relationship. And what are we doing throughout the day and throughout the week? And part of it is that documentation as well. All right. Some regulation strategies. Breathing strategies came out for the zones of regulation. But there are many other curriculum or even non-curriculum-based breathing strategies that kids are taught. And we used to reserve that for certain kids that were exhibiting challenges, right? Or having a hard time coping within the classroom. But now we're pushing that down to tier 1, where we're teaching everyone just some basic strategies. And so breathing practices, quiet time, movement strategies, the sounds in the environment to help focus the attention. Has anybody done a colored breathing technique? Thumbs up if you have, thumbs down if you have. Few thumbs up, most thumbs down. All right, and this works really well with little kids too when you're teaching some breathing strategies. So we'll do it for a second. I want you to think about if you're angry or frustrated or feeling very anxious. You don't have to say it out loud. What color do you think? Think about those emotions of anxiety or frustration. Think about a color. All right. Now I want you to think about a color of calm and happiness. All right. So think about that color. And now I want you to breathe. So I want you to take a slow, deep breath in and a slow, deep breath out. And when you breathe in, I want you to breathe in that calm, happy color. So think that color. You can close your eyes when you do this, and then breathe out whatever that frustrated, angry color is. So you're breathing in a happy color and breathing out an angry, frustrated color. All right, so hopefully you've now breathed in happy, calm colors and thoughts. But again, just it's something, a strategy like that where you're teaching kids breathing strategies. If you already have a curriculum like zones of regulation and you're going in and doing lessons in a tier 1 way and you're teaching kids a breathing technique, then stick with that breathing technique. And say to teachers, put that in your toolbox of ways to help with self-regulation, all right? Don't go in and teach a new breathing technique. Use the one that you're already using, all right? We have some brain intervals here, so opportunities to kind of develop that awareness, and again, recharging, help stimulate learning, taking those breaks. How many folks are doing those kind of brain breaks already? We have, and I think what's going on, we have so much content that we need to cover, right? And in a short amount of time, but you definitely need to take those breaks. It's going to benefit all, and it's definitely going to benefit those kids that have certain triggers, all right? So it also boosts attentiveness and maximizes learning. Think some strategies like an invisible picture, and there's some references in these slides that will be posted. A squiggly story, junk bag, mental math, or story starters, an invisible picture. All right. So I'm going to start a picture, and then you get to finish it. All right. You can finish it however you like. See a lot of circles. See a lot of outside the box things going on. All right. So, just different strategies so you can keep kids interested. A junk bag. How many folks have a junk drawer at home? Or 5? Yeah, or like a whole junk room, right? So, but yeah, like your junk drawer. So think about having a junk bag and you can pull something out. And ask kids to be creative about what is something else that you could use this for. Like you pull out a shoelace, all right, or a safety pin. What else could you use this for versus tying shoes or clipping papers together, all right? Some self-awareness strategies, and your zones of regulation are right up there in this. And again, the idea is working smarter, not harder. If you have things already, use what you have. If you don't have zones of regulation or other types of, I saw strong kids up there as well, and second step comes to mind. If you don't have these things, you don't have to go out and buy these things, right? You already have a framework to build from. And so you can pull in breathing techniques. You can pull in the awareness and kind of thermometer concepts and things like that. You don't have to go out and purchase a whole new curriculum to do this. Use your existing framework to build upon. What I'm saying is if you do already have something purchased and you're using it, align it. And Patty will, I'm sure, be hitting that message as well this afternoon. So thinking about those general posters of what emotions are, so that we're teaching kids a range of emotions. And this isn't just for our young kids. This is for our older kids too. We're either like angry or happy. There's no in between. And it's teaching that range. And sometimes what makes us angry is what's making us scared, right? And understanding fear versus anger, right? And so you can think about, having things in the classroom to have those conversations. I keep pointing to you because you talked about zones of regulation and going into the classroom and having those lessons and giving those kids those toolkits, so that they're well prepared and equipped to just get through their day. And so, thinking about that on a tier 1 level and, bringing in whomever you need, but classroom teachers can also have these conversations. We're not talking about a therapy session here. We're just talking about awareness, and understanding what emotions are and how to identify those emotions. So you can talk about, talking about doing journal prompts about emotions, talk about ranges of emotions, or connecting to characters in a story. I was at a school yesterday and talking about opportunities to respond, and one of the videos I showed was they put up their prompt was, how do you think this fish was feeling in this story? And so students had to write on their response boards what the emotion was. So it's connecting to characters in a story, things like that. So not just, again, thinking that it's just our morning circle time where we engage in discussion about how things affect us and emotions, but also how can you embed that within your curriculum, right? And then a routine for regulation. So a calming corner. How many folks have calming corners in their buildings? Yeah, I've seen more hands for that. With your calming corners, are they, how did that evolve? Was that, yes?
The K-2 inability to suspend prompted our system, elementary schools, to develop an alternative. And one of the options was for every elementary school classroom to develop a calming corner. So that was the expectation. They all are unique and relative to the school and where in the system they are regionally. But it was an expectation mandate from above.
Yeah, so that came as a response of policy, right? Policy-driven, a district request, and then the schools will decide what that looks like.
I was just thinking, there was something, and unfortunately my sound was on my phone, so sorry about that.
You're fine.
But there was something that I saw on Facebook and shared last week about a teacher that was doing a mental health check-in and with sticky notes. And she basically had a part of their morning routine was the kids would go over and they put their sticky note on. The boxes would say, today I'm feeling great, okay, meh, struggling, having a hard time, in a really dark place. And I've seen another one that says at the bottom, I could use another check-in today. And whether it's a kid would have their name assigned to that or whether they would do it anonymously, but then the teacher can kind of keep an eye on, hey, somebody else, this guy needs a little extra TLC today or a check-in. Yeah, I thought it was really cool.
And yeah, I've seen that
And
too.
even for teachers too, I've seen it in teacher workrooms, which I thought was like kind of brilliant because some days our days are struggle, you know.
We could use an extra check-in some days, right? Or check out some days. Yeah.
Check out.
Yep.
Along those lines, another really cool activity that I've heard about is in a teacher workroom to be able to identify, have the name of all the kids up, and have staff identify who they feel that they have a relationship with, and to pinpoint that. And then the ones that don't rise to the top, and then that is sort of your work for the year.
Yeah, I've seen that done too. And I think the example you're giving is a high school example.
Yeah, exactly.
And I've seen that where it's the number of staff that are connected. I've also seen where they have a student name and then different things about them. And this, if you know, the more you know about a student, like what their interests are, about their family, you know, then that gives you, you have a deeper understanding of those kids than some of the kids that you don't know much about, you know. So yeah, there are lots of different ways to do this. I'm going to get you all talking to small groups in a minute about how you're doing this already. But thinking about too, like, pardon me, a signal on the desk for some kind of regulation. So a calm card on the desk, a hand signal, something that would indicate, especially for our kids that are struggling, are going to have a hard time with that regulation, making sure that you have some way in place there for them to be able to indicate, I could use a break, I could use some help. What that teacher did, you know, that quick check in the morning with the Post-it notes could let you know in the beginning of the day how they're doing, but maybe something throughout the day too, so that kids can access that. All right, so what I want you to do at this point, this is where those cards come into play. If you didn't get a card, raise your hand. All right, we'll get over there with some cards. And what I'd like you to do is I would like you to write answers to the following questions. How has your team included SEL within your matrix? And what regulation or self-awareness strategies are being used in your school? I'm going to then ask you, and are these being linked back to the school-wide expectations? And I'm going to ask you to walk around and share with a neighbor, all right? And I have more cards up here. I'll get some for you. And so it's kind of a give and get. I'm going to have you guys stand up in a few minutes and walk around and find somebody that you don't know, all right? So take 3 minutes right now to write those responses down.
Who still needs a card? Keep your hands up, the assistants will come by. Can you get something over there? Get some more cards. You just want
Thanks so much.
Yes, that's true.
I'm going to ask that you just turn and talk to somebody near you instead of getting up and walking around the room. It's got about 12 minutes left. All right, share your ideas, give your ideas, take some ideas.
So non-compliant, huh? You just sat here to listen. Guilty? Sure. Like we had our school is not working at all to SEL up our matrix, and I love that idea of having that final column about when I feel upset. I just texted a picture to my principal. Hey, we should do this summer, and we have some time. And the alternative school for Howard County. So Bill and I do a lot of self-regulation stuff. We have like de-escalation, quiet room. We have behavior therapists who can meet with a person and help them do breathing regulation therapy. But we do mindfulness in the classroom, great grades, go outside, just to hear. We use restorative circles for like community building and check-ins, just answering questions that are as they arise, you know, like thorny issues, and breaking it down and helping problem solving.
I pulled up on
Yeah, have you modified it recently, or is it something that's always been?
Well, this is our first year.
Okay, gotcha.
But we do have a lot of stuff about, you know, how to talk to their applicants, and respect numbers, or using kind of words, or taking care
I guess I should give myself credit. There, ours are like touching kindness, but
our descriptions of taking care of yourself are a pause and press is sort of success or peace and pride in yourself.
Okay.
So both of those kind of go back to, you know, you're working hard, you're there every day, you're trying your best, you're making mistakes, things like that. Kind of, right. And I know I went to this meeting in January, and there was someone in there talking about a bunch of different emotions. And it was essentially, it was on the school-wide matrix. It was kind of like, if I know that you have a problem with anger,
here's
you
the
would get a
thing.
special one into your folder that was, if I am angry in this setting, if I'm angry in this setting.
Oh, I'd love to
Which is
see
kind of
that.
cool. Because then obviously you can create one.
Was
for
that something
anger.
that you shared out here? The big thing, or was it like somebody else just had it?
I actually honestly
Oh my gosh, that sounds great. Like a little perspective.
All right, I'm going to ask them to come together in a minute.
And it would be for What we do, the self-awareness strategies for regular teacher is
Okay.
we don't have anything like this. It's more
Just individual
teachers,
intervention.
some teachers we have conversations with
Yeah.
but and you can kind of
All right. We're going to get through the rest of the content before we leave for this session, not today, for this session. But so let's talk about now some relationship strategies. And how many folks are doing some kind of circle in the morning? Whatever you want to call it, a morning meeting, a circle, or something like that. And so those are opportunities for developing those relationships, right? This is where you can do those check-ins, the sharings, the greetings, etc. Some folks will also do some student and family surveys where they'll get information from students and families and ask, you can also get some specific information here too, as far as like, how do you want to be praised? How do they learn best? What is your home environment like? What do they see as their strengths and weaknesses, among other things? So there are other ways to get information about kids. How do you want to get praised could be a big way to identify how you're interacting with the kids so you're not unintentionally asserting a trigger into their environment, right? Getting some of their background information, etc. Some other strategies to help connect. Copycat is getting folks to kind of mirror what each other are doing. Anybody hear of the multiplayer thumb war? Yes or no? Okay. I was going to have us do it, but we're running out of time. It's where you do you can Google a TED Talk on it. It didn't start from the woman who does the TED Talk, but it could be it's thumb war, like 1, 2, 3, 4, I declare a thumb war. You get multiple hands in there. You can get 3 or 4 hands in at a time. And then what you can do is connect the whole room together. So you put like your hand in here, and then you have another circuit here, and you can get the whole room involved. So just getting that kind of feeling of connectedness, right? In small, short ways, and other strategies as well. All right. So I want to move on to talking about responses, those corrective kind of responses when a problem behavior does occur, and make sure I can get in that information before we leave this session. And so we talk about this within our Tier 1 content. We talk about the kind of continuum of responses. And you want to make sure that you have kind of a sequence of engagement when we're thinking about this. We're thinking about this through that kind of reasoning, relate, and regulate mindset, all right, and how we respond to kids. And when we think about those appropriate responses, what we're doing here is, if done well, we're empowering students and teachers with those resiliency skills, right? And this is where your mind should start thinking, we're thinking about that kind of restorative process here, right? And so again, another area of alignment. So it helps students to regulate their emotions, etc. All right. And so a lot of these strategies here are ones that we talked about in the prevention realm too, right? And so now what we're talking about is not just how do we do that in the prevention realm, but how do we provide students and build their skills in these areas so when they do encounter difficulties, that they are well versed in this replacement behavior, right, than what they did before. Part of this too is modeling. Our modeling, when we're in a situation where kids are elevated and not using the best self-regulation skills, we can get upset too. So we need to model our self-regulation skills. But the repetitive breathing, brain breaks, focused attention, engage, don't engage. We also want to be thinking about the types of statements that we share in these situations, So when you see a student who is frustrated or getting elevated, instead of calm down, And you can think of things like, I can see you're having a difficult time. Let me try to help. You know, let's focus on fixing the problem together. You seem agitated. What's really going on? All right. And so using our language differentially when we are responding to kids, they're in this heightened state. All right. And relating here, that's one of those components as well, right? And not just kind of dismissing. You know, I can't do anything right. Well, you don't want a student to feel that way, right? But it's not often the best response to say, well, that's not true. You do many things right. And that is probably the truth. But it isn't kind of relating to the state that they're in at that moment. And can also then, you know, think about your escalation cycle and the whole de-escalation process. Could also be a potential trigger for that behavior escalating because you're not hearing that kid, you're not relating to that kid. So saying something instead of this, it must feel frustrating to feel like you never do anything right. Right? Simple strategies that we aren't our go-to reflex, though, right? I'm a school psychologist, so my go-to reflex is a little bit more like that, but I'll be honest with you, I could fall right back into that if I'm not kind of thinking about it and being mindful and intentional about how I'm responding to kids, right? So it goes back to that intentionality and doing things purposely. All right. And then going back to those restorative questions. When we are dealing with a problem behavior, when we are dealing with an incident that happened, responding in a restorative way, all right? So I was going to ask you to do, to take down some next steps or some 2 takeaways. And you can, before you leave today, if you want to take down some notes on some takeaways that you have, feel free to do that. But what I think some next steps would be, or that I envision from this content, is thinking about working with your teams and others in your building. So think about who in your building has been charged to be that trauma-informed person or that RP person in your building, because I think you could fold in restorative practices in this language too. And when you hear potty talk in a few minutes, it'll all talk, it's like all alignment soup, right? That's what it comes down to. It's about a big bowl of alphabet soup and we're all in this party together. You want to identify those current classroom practices, and if you haven't been training those core features, those 8 classroom management practices as part of your annual professional development, I suggest including that in there. Think about that classroom matrix. Think about how you're delivering behavior-specific praise or responding to behaviors, and think about how do you fold in this trauma-informed lens. Identify any gaps that you have. And think about this, the intentionality, and talking to staff about doing this with intentionality and acknowledging the fact that they're probably doing a ton of this already, all right? But again, thinking about that intentionality, thinking about the impact of trauma, using that bear analogy. People use other animals, the bear analogy I kind of like. And then action plan. What do you want to focus on for professional development? And then always think about what supports you're going to put in place if you're going to fold in something new. So if you're going to ask staff to develop a classroom matrix that includes calming strategies or your SEL curriculum, how are you going to support them in doing that? And not you individually, but how is your team going to support them? Do you have a group of staff that can help support other staff? Okay. So we have an increased awareness of the prevalence of trauma in our society and the impact that has on kids, and not just the immediate, but the long-term impact as well. And you know, we see the immediate impact in our classrooms, but we don't see as a long-term impact that is, it can be very, very bad for individuals who've experienced trauma. We also do have an increased awareness of trauma-informed practices. But what we need to be working on is that intentionality, the explicit instruction of those regulated skills, awareness skills, and relationship building skills. All kids will benefit from that, but students that have experienced trauma will benefit greatly from that, right? That's a prevention approach. That's building those resiliency skills so that you can kind of change hopefully the trajectory of the impact of those traumatic events on the kid's life by building those skills and really focusing on all. Right? We would love for you to provide feedback on this session and the other sessions. So if you have not received an evaluation form, it would be great if you grab one before you left for the day. And Patty will be in here after this session, so you can leave the evaluation forms on a chair in the back or as you're on your way out. Maybe I'll put something down there for you to be able to leave your evaluation forms in. But it would be really helpful if you provided feedback for us, because we take a look at that feedback to help inform future coaches meetings. All right. We are at time, but I will stay here for another few minutes if folks have questions, and enjoy the rest of the conference. All right. Thank you.